Yesterday, what we did is we looked at primary directions. And we started with looking at dated events that have the possibility of being rectifying events. Today we're going to look at secondary progressions, but secondary progressions do not lend themselves easily to rectification. Secondary progressions, there's more slip, and the definition of things is not as sharp. And that's exactly what you expect for secondary directions, because they come from the desire world. And the desire world is one world removed from the world of thought where the things originate. Also in the desire world is a more of a feeling of flow. Things flow into each other. Our emotions are like that. They're not clear cut between the distinction between one emotion and another. People who are emotional people have a much different quality about them than people who are mental people. Mental people tend to be much more didactic. In the image that we've been using, when we drop a stone into the kiddie's pool, the shape of the impact wave is the shape of the stone at the moment of impact. By the time of the first ring outward, everything is circular. And the amplitude is, it's pretty good. But by the time it becomes the second wave, the second wave is much more, the amplitude is much more damped, and things are beginning to level out, so to speak. So secondary progressions have more of a mood or an attitude about them which may or may not result in events. And a lot of it depends on how intense the progression is. And that brings up the matter of something that everybody wants to know that works with dynamic astrology. How long does the effect of a progression last? We could have asked that same question with regard to primary directions, but it would have required much, much more accuracy than we had. Then you have to get experience with it, and you have to be pretty pinpoint to know how long the effect lasts. In astrology in general, duration is what is determined by, or is the determining factor of the influence. So deciding or determining the orb of influence is a matter of judgment and experience or intuition. Orbs in secondary progressions follow the same kind of optimization as in natal astrology. If an orb is too small, some of the period of effect will be missed, but it will be very clear and it will be very distinct what you do determine. If an orb is too large, nothing will be missed, but the period may have some time, part of it, the influence is so faint that it isn't really meaningful. And if you're working with somebody and you're trying to prepare their consciousness and for meeting the things of life, if the effect is too faint, people might think, oh, there's nothing to this, and they'll be unprepared when the real strong effect does occur. Now, in the first talk, we said that progressions worked from the Mars inward, that is Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and Mars, and that Those were usually the most important significators in secondary progressions. In my experience, progressions of the sun usually seem to be stronger and more significant than the progressions of the other inner planets. However, sometimes progressions of Mars, because they hang on for a long time, can match the strength of the progressions of the sun. For the other inner planets, the secondary progressions depend on other factors. Everything always goes back to the natal horoscope. And if a planet is very strong in the natal horoscope, it will be very strong when it is worked with in progressions. We'll see that later on today when we start looking at it. So the orbs of the non-solar inner planets should probably be smaller because their effect is less, and if you want to get the clear-cut effect, you want to use a very small orb. It's not, if you do work with outer planets and progressions, it's not unusual to work with orbs that are just a very few minutes of space. When the orbs are critical, the effects are intense, and it almost seems incessant. The worst thing that I have seen is if somebody has a natal Sun conjoined Saturn that is past the culmination. What happens is Saturn, by progression, very slowly inches up to the natal position of the Sun, and it just gets heavier and heavier and heavier. Oh. All right. Since the Sun moves 1 degree per day on the average, each day after birth represents 1 year of life. I have found from experience that an orb of 1.5 degrees is pretty optimal. Pretty much that, if you work with that, you're doing the best that you can. This means then that there's a period of 1.5 years of build-up to culmination, and then 1.5 years of diminishing effect. So you can say that in total, a progression will have an influence of about 3 years. That is a solar progression. If there's going to be an event, the event is most likely to occur around the culmination time. However, there are many other factors, such as other primary or secondary directions or progressions occurring at the same time, or if there's transits at the same time, or it sometimes depends on the lunation cycle. So there takes quite a few things converging to determine when an event will happen. On top of that, each person has their own style of events. For example, martial people try to always have events happen ahead of time, prematurely. When I was younger, and there were situations that I wasn't certain about the outcome, I would precipitate a crisis just to get it over with. You know what I mean? That's Mars kind of thinking. Let's get this over with and be done, and things will be clear after that. On the other hand, Saturnine people try to string things out for a long time until they can, get a good angle on it. It's very rare, though, for an event to occur after the culmination of a progressed aspect. Mercury and Venus move at approximately the speed of the Sun, because they're with the sun in the heavens, and so a degree and a half orb for them is works fine too. Mars, I probably use a 1 degree orb. Now progressions, secondary progressions of the moon are different from all other secondary progressions. Roughly speaking, the moon goes through 1 degree of space in an hour and 50 minutes. So you can say that it goes through an hour of space basically in 2 hours of time. A degree of space in 2 hours of time. If we use our progression velocity of a day equaling a year, this means that the moon is within an orb of a degree and a half for less than 2 months. Therefore, lunar progressions have a duration of less than 2 months to culminate and disappear. That's pretty rapid. And so therefore, lunar secondary progressions are different than all of the others. And they move so fast that it's very hard to determine a quality or a feel to them. Max Heindel, and I agree with Max Heindel completely on this, uses the progressed moon as a triggering thing, so that when there's a progressed lunar aspect, it'll trigger something else that is right in the horoscope and not necessarily produce its own events. Max Heindel used to call the moon the second hand or the minute hand on the clock of destiny. Now, there's a whole lot more that we could say about all of this, and some of it will come along the way. So we'll try to get some more understanding as we go. Let's do something similar to what we did yesterday. And let's work first from life to astrology. Wait just a second, please. Feeling better?
Not really.
Oh. Good morning.
Did you get my message?
A phone message?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I called about 20 minutes ago and we left it.
Oh, yeah.
Elizabeth and Amy are coming.
Yeah, I figured something like that. Preparations.
Oh, and I forgot my books, my papers in the car. Oh, and I gave them notebook and all my cards.
Oh, but were you here yesterday? Yes, you were. You have one of these, don't you?
I got one of those.
Oh, how could you?
I got mine.
Boy, am I tired. By the end of the week, I'm going to be sagging.
It's supposed to be cooler tomorrow.
No, it's just a matter of sleep. This is for me. I'm never awake at this hour of the morning. This is about the time I'm starting to get out of bed. But my garden is starting to come on really nicely now. And some of the things that were basically dormant during those hot days are now starting to perk up. Which means what was going to be an early garden is going to turn out to be a late garden.
Oh, did you just notice it today or late last night? Or?
What's that, the garden? Oh, no, the gardens for the last 3 or 4 days now has perked up. And the chipmunks are back. Last year they were here much earlier than this year.
I think they've been here, but they've been hiding under the ground and stuff.
Yeah.
I saw them in the heat, they'd come up every once in a while and they'd be looking for food and they were having trouble.
Those are gophers usually that spend their time underground.
Oh, gophers.
Yeah. I have both gophers and chipmunks.
Okay.
Chipmunks usually like to be in hollow logs and things like that, and gophers have to go underground.
The gophers are really little.
No, the gopher is actually bigger than the chipmunk. Chipmunk is about this long without the tail, and the gopher is about that long without the tail.
I'm talking about gophers, probably.
Yeah. Gophers have sort of a long, sagging belly, a gopher belly, whereas the chipmunk is just a frisky little thing. It's very compact, and it's very nervous. More nervous even than a squirrel. Its tail is jiggling all over the place. Well, keep going? Okay. So we're going to work from life through astrology, because life is the most important thing. And we study astrology so that we can live our life better and so that we can get much more out of our life. If what we are saying is true, if secondary progressions function the way we say they do, we should get a good feel for them by working in this way. Now, we did the same thing for familiarization with primary directions when we worked with dated events. We can't do that with secondary progressions because they don't lend themselves to rectification, and they don't lend themselves to precision predictions. Actually, both primary directions and secondary progressions need other things. They need like the lunation cycle or something like that to trigger events. Now, this means that we're talking about forecasting periods of trial or periods of triumph, and to get the flavor of periods of time. And that is probably more important than prediction of events. I have very rarely found prediction of events to be valuable for many things except to impress people. However, with people learning how to cope with different seasons of attitude is something that's always important. All right, the repaired schlock that we're working with, this horoscope, had a highly significant period that lasted about 5 years or so, and it had a large number of events that occurred in it. During that 5-year period, there was a major illness, cancer, and that resulted in the loss of half of a lung. Also during that period was a dissolution of his marriage, a rediscovery of his first sweetheart, and the failure to complete a marriage with that same sweetheart. Now that period is 1979 through 1983, and it's found on pages 22 and 23 of the handout.
1979 to 1983.
Yeah. In late autumn of 1979, the native had a flu, and the flu turned into pneumonia, and it was really very extreme. And the pneumonia couldn't be overcome, so the native was put into the hospital and given intravenous antibiotics. And still didn't get rid of it. And so they did x-rays and eventually did a needle biopsy and a spot in the lung, and it turned out to be a very large lung tumor. By looking at number 41 on page 22, you see where it says secondary progression. By looking at that, you see that the progressed sun is square to the natal Neptune. Now, yesterday we talked about the natal Neptune being opposite to the moon. And we talked about the terrible teasing that this person had as a child because of falling in the slop bucket and things like that. And since Neptune is conjoined the ascendant and the moon always has a part in the personality, this person had a very negative personal image. And the negative image developed in early childhood is reinforced by the sun being in Scorpio, basically with only difficult aspects, the opposition to Uranus being important. But Elman Bacher, for example, who's a very good astrologer, says that the sun in Scorpio tends to focus on inner darkness. And that described this person very negative about self and then having a personal image problem. The moon and Neptune are the two most imaginative planets. So with Neptune in the 12th house, there was a lot of unconscious imagination going on in this person, enough to produce an entity which in turn produced a cancerous growth. And the imagination was strong enough so that it could spur the growth processes in the body to keep up with it, and that's what happens. It's just tumors are very rapid growth. The vital body is affected in such a way that it spends all of its energy in growth rather than in maintenance. Now, Neptune and the moon, when they are afflicted with each other, are planets of treachery. The treachery became manifest when the wife of the native became very insecure about the native's illness and about the native's very rebellious manner of dealing with that illness. And so the wife took secret lovers. Later, in this whole 5-year episode, his first sweetheart literally left him standing at the altar, and to the native, this seemed to be treachery in both cases. The second event occurred almost simultaneously with the being left at the altar. And that's shown on in 1983. Let's see, 1983 is plus 45. And plus 45, the secondary progression of the sun came square to the moon. So the whole Cancer episode began when the sun was square to Neptune, which is opposite the moon, and it reached its final culmination when the progressed sun squared the moon. This is almost textbook the way this works out. There's a lot of details we could go in, and it's just marvelous the way the timing all went. But after years, 7 years or so, of having gone through this experience and pondered it and pondered it and pondered it, the conclusion that the native came to was that there probably was an entity in the tumor. And that entity was a guilt embodiment. That the native had negative views of himself. He would not forgive himself his own treachery, probably from a past life, because Neptune's in the 12th house, and that's the immediately preceding life. Christ forgave him, but he wouldn't forgive himself. So in self-hatred, he developed the entity. This was a very busy period, because if you look at plus 43, that's one of the events there. That's when the native, the mother of the native died. And just shortly before the mother died, the father had cancer and had part of his colon removed. If we look on page 30 and 31, way in the back, if you look at 44A, 44B, and 44C, you find there is a transit that takes place at that time that is significant to all of this. Let's see here. I don't have it all written down in my notes. Oh, it is, one of them is Uranus passing over Venus. Neptune is square to the moon. And I guess that's about it. The Neptune is square to the moon by transit, and that is reinforcing, and that indicates the Cancer in relatives surrounding this person. The transit to Venus corresponded to the time when the native rediscovered his love and he moved to California to be with her. There are a number of other astrological and life phenomena. I think there was 2 automobile accidents and 2 robberies and a bicycle accident, all in the same period. It was a rather gruesome period for the native. There's too much to go into all of them. What is important is that we take time to ponder the meaning of these symbols and to ponder the meaning of these events. When you're going through them, the attitudes that you have are not the attitudes that are most conducive for understanding them. But when it's over, or if you can go into a deeply meditative state that you are impersonal, then you can see what the meaning of it all is. And so that is how this native came to understand that the Cancer was self-produced, and it was self-produced in guilt and self-righteousness, and the guilt was about having been treacherous to others that had had placed trust in him in a past life. And the final conclusion that the native came to out of all of this is that the reason for not keeping faith in the past life was desire. And that the ultimate lesson of this whole thing is how to deal with desire. And strangely enough, very, very recently, in fact, in the moment, the desire is coming ripe in a way that the native never ever would have expected. All right. Now let's look at some other things. Let's look on page 16. +5 and +6. They show the application and separation of the progressed Mercury over the natal Venus. We looked at this with rectifiable events yesterday. This was the birth of the sister of the native. And it wasn't easily found. We found something, but it wasn't obvious, and we would have had to have rectified to have completely found it. If you look in the natal chart, there are two planets in the third house, Mercury and Venus. Mercury is the strongest planet by far in this horoscope, so its secondary progressions are more likely to be significant than those of Venus or any other planet. There are transits. If you look at +6, there is a transit, and that's shown on page 28. The transiting Mars conjoins the natal Mercury at the same time that the progressed Mercury is conjoining Venus. And this is the birth of the sister. Jupiter transits conjoined to Neptune. All of these show a very strong spiritual connection, both emotional and intellectual, between these two members of the family. The natal Mercury is very strong, and it makes favorable aspects for the most part. Venus is medium strength, and everything that happens to Venus is very good, very positive. So this aspect lightened the individual up. Otherwise, it would have been much too serious. In fact, the native and the native sister used to indulge in all kinds of creative humor together. All right. Now, secondary progressions of the planets are not the only secondary progressions one looks for. Sometimes you look at secondary progressions of cusps, especially primary cusps. That is the midheaven, the ascendant, the descendant, and the nadir. If you look on page 18 at +15, you see that there is the progressed ascendant conjoins to the natal Mars. This is identical in sidereal time to what we looked at yesterday. And both point to the same thing, to the knee injury. The only difference is that the given cusps are each reached according to a different time scale. With primary directions, it's reached in 15 4-minute intervals. Whereas with the progressions, it takes 15 days that have 4-minute differences in sidereal time. Apart from the cusps, things are very different. In the 60 minutes after birth, using primary directions, the planets had hardly moved. But in 15 days after birth, they had moved quite a bit. So, for example, then the progressed Sun was conjoined to the natal Mercury in the horoscope. Mercury in the natal horoscope is almost exactly trine to natal Moon. So this indicates that at the same time there was an outward accident that affected the personality, the physical body of the person, there was an awakening of intellectual consciousness. And if you remember yesterday, the accident occurred and reoccurred every time that the person, the native, tried to do things by force instead of finesse. And so this lesson is very obvious when you bring in the secondary progression and you add it to the primary direction. It's likely that the event occurred, I don't have the exact date for it, when the progressed moon also conjoined Mars. It was right in that time frame. It is, in order to get a more emphatic picture of what was happening at this minute, let's bring in some transits. If you look on page 28 in the selected transits at +15, In 13th of August 1953, there was the exact opposition of the transiting Pluto to the natal Jupiter. And by the time of the event, which was a little bit later than August, Pluto had moved to a square with the natal Mercury. So there is a lot of abuse of power as well as abuse of force. This person could have been an inquisitor or something like that in a past life. So that there is an understanding that develops in the consciousness by going through the experience. Because you have to remember that we're all divine beings. And when we have experiences in life, whether we in our consciousness, our waking consciousness, are aware of it or not, we're having experiences that are cosmic. We're understanding the cosmic environment, and these lessons, when they come to us, bring us an understanding of things that we have done right or could do right, and things that we have done wrong. And in this case, not only was it a warning to not use force, but it was a matter of the native abusing power and trying to overpower situations, and all of that comes ripe with the transits, the secondary progressions, and the primary directions coming ripe at the same time. This is what results in an event in life, and this is why events in life are so interesting. All right, let's turn to page 19. There's a whole bunch of events that take place between plus 23 and plus 25. On plus 23, there's a secondary progression. Plus 24, there's a primary direction. And in plus 25, there's a secondary progression again and a transit at the same time. So there's a whole lot of things going on here. At plus 23 is when the directed and progressed descendant came opposite to the progressed Saturn, not the natal Saturn, but the progressed Saturn. And this is actually very accurately the time that the native had the nephritis and was hospitalized and was just at the very edge of death. This native tends to precipitate events earlier, and this is a good example of that. It also indicates that what Max Heindel said, that the opposite sign is almost as important as the primary sign. And in this case, the opposite sign to Aries, where Saturn is located, is Libra. And so the kidneys are affected by something that is triggered in Aries. Between 23 and 24, again, this would have to be rectified to be accurate. The secondary progressions are that the Sun conjoins the natal Venus. And this indicates an ardent interest in philosophy. In 25, the progressed Sun is sextile to the natal Mars, showing that this event or this series of events that occurs in this time with the disease, and we're going to see later on very big things occurred in this same period, brought out enormous energy. The person had boundless energy after these events and could easily work 20 hours a day every day. It is as though having the illness caused the person to become serious. And when the person became serious, there was concentration. And with concentration of energy, it became stronger. We'll come back to this tomorrow when we look at transits, and then things will be much clearer about it.
Question.
Yes, sir.
In number 23, when you talked about the nephritis.
Yes.
The fact that Saturn is basically at the what do you call it, the descendant.
Yep.
And that Libra, which Libra does govern the kidneys, does it not?
Yep.
Okay. So the fact that the Libra is at the ascendant, which is the house of the personal stuff.
Yep.
Is that when things are more likely to occur versus
Yes.
was the other way around, that Aries was?
Yeah. It's the combination of the two put together.
What I'm getting at, though, is if Aries was on the ascendant with Saturn,
then it would be more likely something with the head. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And see, the thing I was trying to point to, that I didn't go enough into detail, Saturn is retrograde. And the progressed Saturn, therefore, is at a lower degree number. If you look at the basic horoscope, Saturn is at 1237. And the progressed Saturn is at 1134. And when the progression comes to the progressed Saturn, it gets there before it gets to the natal position, and that's because this native tends to precipitate things early. Wants to get it over with. And takes the earliest possible time to do that. All right.
Excuse me, Richard. I think you said that progressed Mars was opposing progressed Saturn.
Yeah.
I think you meant progressed ascendant opposing progressed Saturn.
It would progress ascendant opposite the progressed Saturn. Yeah. I'm a little blurry this morning, and I'm not seeing things very clearly. All right. Before moving on, there's an important point to be made about what we're talking about now. In both natal and dynamic astrology, convergence and especially redundancy magnify all astrological influence. That is to say that if there are several things taking place at the same time, they both strengthen each other, even if they're not like each other. If there's a square and a triangle going on at the same time, the square and the triangle will both be magnified just because they are in the same common time period. That's why we're looking at the periods in life where there are coincidences of progressions, directions, and transits, because they turn out to be the most significant. And it's clear if you look at the life, if you do this with your own life and you look at these periods, you'll find out that they are the most major importance. All right. The next secondary progression we want to look at is page 20. We want to look at number 31 on page 20. There is a primary direction, a secondary progression, and a transit. This is the year 1969. And the way we're looking at things, we're looking at it, loosely. Anywhere from 68 to 70, because we'd have to, again, rectify to get everything very precise. So this is another important period. We saw yesterday that the primary direction of the 8th house cusp conjoining Uranus had an occult influence on this native and the activities at this time. This is when the individual began offering classes and was given help from the inner worlds at that time. In In 1969, right around the time of plus 31, the secondary progression of the Sun came trine to Saturn. And that has a very serious quality about it. And the Uranus primary direction, which occurred earlier, had the quality of triggering something. But it was the 8th house cusp, so we see that there is an influence with the Sun natally in this person being in the 2nd house, Uranus being in the 2nd sign, and so there was a lot to do with responsibility. And the progression of the Sun coming trine to Saturn indicates that kind of responsibility. And it was at this time that the native began a career working with computers. With both the Sun and Uranus in play at the same time, it was a matter of self-reliance and self-education. And the native had to completely teach himself everything about the computer because there was nobody else to do it. And he had to perform on the job, which meant a lot of all-night work and things like that. So this is another one of those multiple factor periods of time. It was at this time when that the native opened a bookshop, and that would not have been possible if the professional opportunity had not come. And if you're really interested, the professional opportunity came in May of 69. And the full moon in May of 69 exactly conjoined the 2nd house Sun of the native. And the bookshop was opened 2 or 3 days after the new moon conjoined the dragon's head in Scorpio in the 2nd house. So we can see that with all of this 2nd house and Taurus influence and the responsibility at the inauguration of a profession and a secondary profession, that this person is meant to be a responsibility person. Not so much a career person or not so much a laborer, but somebody who has responsibility. We'll come back to this again tomorrow when we're looking at the transits, because we'll bring out even more.
Another quick question.
Yes.
When you opened the bookstore after the new moon, were you already doing astrology at that time?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. We've already looked at the ones at plus 41 and plus 45, and they were concomitant with the lung cancer and the partnership relations. Let's move past that and let's move to page 24.
What page?
24. Page 24 in the horoscope we're looking at is at plus 55. This has 2 secondary progressions. One of them is that the progressed Sun comes square to the natal Mars. And the other is that the progressed Mars comes conjoined to the natal Sun. So there's a lot of redundancy in quality and activity. So this should be a very, very important Marshall type period. It was a time for self-understanding with the nature of the Sun, but there was no major event. Instead, there were a lot of little events that dribbled in, and I don't know the astrological reason for that. Perhaps if the directed ascendant had advanced a couple of degrees beyond that, there might have been an event. Now, earlier today and yesterday it was mentioned that the native was rather goofy. and had a lot of negative personal images because of the feedback from all of that. And there was a lot of self-dislike that comes from self-righteousness, being able to down himself, to deprecate himself. It was also mentioned yesterday and today that with Mars in Libra, there was not an abundance of courage. Now there's an exceedingly strong Mercury and Scorpio in the third house. The native can mentally grasp and understand dangers and can understand them very clearly. But the response to danger is usually fight or flight. And this native is very strong on flight. It doesn't take much and he's out of there. By this time, the negative images that were responsible with the Cancer were being worked out. So there was not so much self-deprecation and self-negation. There was still a hefty amount of negativity, but even that is with time being marginalized. Now, through a series of major events, the negative images have been or are being excised, but the lack of courage was still not dealt with. And this was a period of time that had to be dealt with. The native was somebody who preferred being a gallant in appearance, but not necessarily in action. And the lesson of learning to do things with finesse instead of force was overdone, because this natal horoscope has a lot of oppositions in it, and oppositions are aspects of extremism. And this person was so extremist that almost every lesson was carried too far. And in this period then, having to deal with the excessive cowardliness had to be dealt with. Now, Mars in the natal horoscope in the first house indicates direct outward activity, while the Sun in the second house is dealing with things as responsibilities. During this period that we're examining, the native was responsible for maintenance and purchase and repairs and all kinds of contracts. And if any of you have ever dealt with the business world, you almost certainly notice immediately that there is much more interest in company representatives to sell than there is to honor warranties or to stick with their promises. And what happens is that phone calls and emails are ignored, and promises are not kept, even though they are intended to be kept. And it's not a good environment for a mild-mannered, non-confrontational person. However, there was a responsibility. And this was a very important period for the native to learn to be able to get angry. Not mad that you lose control of it all, but really get angry and push people until they fulfill their obligations. Now, anger is not usually a desirable emotion, though the ability to assert energy and to keep on asserting energy until what is to be accomplished has been accomplished is an important thing. Now, when something has been dormant and underutilized for a long time. When it is finally addressed, a person often overshoots. It's like you open the radiator in your car when it's hot. It just blasts out of there. If you let it sit for a while, it doesn't. And this anger on the part of the native was an overshoot. But it's interesting that after this period was over, the anger went away. But there's also less tendency on the part of the native to let things slide, though there still is plenty of tendency to run away from things. All right, now let's look on to something else. In the natal horoscope, Venus is retrograde. And the progressed retrograde lasted most of the life. And it did not go direct until 1977 at plus 39. And on page 26, at age of 65, it finally progressed to its natal position. It's like saying that all of the recap work that had to be done and things that had to be refelt was over, and then forward progress could be made. So at that time, Venus came into its own. And, for example, almost all of the lady friends that this person has had have complained that he loves philosophy more than he loves romance. And that is expectable. And since this conjunction, when the progressed Venus got back to its natal position and started moving forward, that has increased appreciably. Now, Venus also rules the 9th house, which is the house of travel. And after this progressed conjunction, the native began to take a lot of long trips, long in distance and long in duration. And they didn't begin exactly until the progressed ascendant reached the natal dragon's head. On page 27, at plus 70 and plus 74, the sun first trines Neptune and then sextiles the moon, which hasn't occurred yet. So this is a time of spiritualization and an ability to do something positive with the lessons that were learned when that progressed T-square was going on, and there was the Cancer and all of those things. And it's really amazing that things have recently come into the life of this person that it is a shock. And he's been afraid more than he's ever been afraid in his life before. All right, but we can see we're brought right up to date for what's going on right now. There are other progressions. Many of them are not listed because I didn't want to do too many in this because we're doing too many. But if we look at plus 73 on page 27, and this one is for Mark and for Bob Victor. In the natal horoscope, this person has very strong tendencies to self-righteousness. And Jupiter in the natal Uranus, in his youth, used to mean cramps in the calves of his legs. And that was when he had pride in how much he could work. And now he has pride in how much he can walk. And at age plus 73, the progressed Mars has moved into a very slow moving square with the natal Jupiter. And the cramps have returned. And the Koepsel are associated, or that Mars square Jupiter is associated with being boldly self-righteous and outspoken. And the native tends to battle with bicyclists on the sidewalk, much to the chagrin of his friends. Some progress has been made with the Koepsel, but the outbursts are slowly going down. But it's interesting to see that how one is shamed into having to learn things, and it's all involved with friends, the Aquarian quality of it's all. All right, what's going to happen is now tomorrow we're going to work with transits, and we're going to work with just a very few things with transits, and then on Friday we're going to do something that puts this all into focus, because there's a very great weakness. If you look in any book of progressions and transits and things like that, you find a stupendous weakness about which nothing is done. And on Friday we're going to try and correct that. But right now we'll close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. I'm sorry that I'm just tired. I'm not being really especially clear.
There's something about this week, because everybody at our place almost, it was just absolutely tired.
Yeah, it might be.
Still sleeping at 10, and Amy got up at 10.
Well, what's happening with me is that I'm a creature of habit, which is not a good thing, because when you have to do things with different habits, then you really suffer, and I'm just not getting enough rest.
I asked you that one question about the Aries and that. Now, what if Saturn was over here on the natal chart? Would that mean that they would be likely to, in Libra, that they would be likely to get any problems from birth until it progresses out of that?
Not necessarily. Yeah, you just have to look at how every situation, which is individual, how it develops. Each one develops in its own time. Congenital things are usually first house things that are there from birth. If they are fetal conditions before you were born, then they have to do with the 12th house, but close enough to be conjoined to the ascendant. Oh, yeah.